In the mountains of West Virginia, America dropped bombs on its own striking coal miners. In Colorado, women and children burned alive beneath a tent colony under machine gun fire. In Arizona, over 1,000 workers were loaded into cattle cars and abandoned in the desert. In Chicago, a bomb exploded in the middle of a labor rally, igniting nationwide panic. And across America's industrial frontier, workers, mine owners, private armies, and even the U.S. government went to war with each other. This wasn't happening in some collapsing empire overseas. This was happening in the United States. During the rise of the American industry, labor disputes became riots, and the riots became massacres. And massacres, they became open warfare. Tonight, we begin exploring 7 of the darkest labor conflicts in American history.
Shadows drift and time grows old. No voice to call, no path to take. Just fog and fear with every ache. Souls in the fog.
By the late 1800s, America was transforming into an industrial superpower. Railroads stretched across the continent, steel mills burned day and night, coal mines carved deep into the Appalachian Mountains. Fortunes were being made faster than ever before, but beneath that prosperity, millions of workers lived in brutal conditions. Factory shifts regularly lasted 12 to 16 hours, safety laws barely existed, child labor was widespread, and entire towns were often controlled by the very companies employing its residents. As working conditions worsened, labor unions began growing rapidly across the country. Workers demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and better pay. But many business owners saw unions as dangerous threats to industry, their profits, and the social order itself. Soon, strikes began erupting across America, and in some places, those strikes turned deadly. The country was choking on smoke, steel, and human exhaustion. Men disappeared in deafening factories before sunrise, and for those who returned home, it was long after dark. Children vanished into mills that some never left. Entire immigrant neighborhoods lived packed together beneath the shadow of America's industrial empire. Workers flooded the streets demanding a simple thing: 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, 8 to live. By the 1880s, Chicago was one of the fastest growing industrial cities on earth. Railroads cut across the city in every direction. Factories thundered day and night. Smoke poured endlessly from giant industrial plants that stretched across entire neighborhoods. Much of the city's workforce came from immigrant communities. Germans, Bohemians, Irish, Polish, and Eastern European laborers arrived hoping to build better lives in America. Instead, they found themselves trapped in brutal working conditions. Factory workers often labored 10, 12, and sometimes 16 hours a day. The injuries were extremely common, safety laws were non-existent, and losing your job could mean starvation and death. One of the largest factories in the city belonged to the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. The company produced agricultural machines, especially mechanical reapers used to harvest grain across America's expanding farmland. But inside the factory walls, tensions were growing. Workers accused the company of low wages, dangerous conditions, and union suppression. Then came the growing demand spreading across the entire country, the 8-hour workday movement. Labor organizations announced that on May 1, 1886, workers nationwide would strike for shorter hours. Hundreds of thousands joined the movement. By the spring of 1886, Chicago was already on edge. Across the city, labor strikes were spreading from factory to factory. Railroad workers walked off their jobs. Packing house laborers organized demonstrations. Crowds flooded the streets demanding shorter workdays and better pay. To business owners and wealthy industrialists, the growing labor movement looked dangerous, looked like a threat to their unearned wealth. But to many workers, it felt like survival. Entire families depend on factory wages that could disappear overnight. Injuries were common and healthcare was not. And for immigrants arriving in America with almost nothing, losing a job could mean hunger, eviction, or worse. In the months leading up to May of 1886, labor disputes at McCormick had already turned ugly. The company locked out union workers and replaced many of them with strikebreakers, scabs. Men willing to cross the picket lines and work during the strike. Angry laborers outside the gates, these replacement workers became symbols of betrayal. Violence between strikers and scabs became increasingly common. And hanging over everything was the growing influence of the radical labor politics. Chicago had become a center for anarchists, socialists, labor organizers, and many of them immigrants from Germany and Eastern Europe who had witnessed political unrest firsthand in Europe before arriving in America. They published newspapers, organized rallies, and gave fiery speeches condemning industrial capitalism and police violence. To supporters, the labor class, they were the activists fighting for working people. To critics, the wealthy, they were dangerous revolutionaries. Newspapers increasingly warned that Chicago's labor movement was becoming infected with radicalism. Some articles described anarchists as being foreign terrorists plotting to overthrow American society itself. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of workers joined what became one of the largest labor strikes in American history. In Chicago alone, tens of thousands marched through the streets carrying banners demanding the 8-hour workday. For a moment, many hoped the demonstrations might remain peaceful, but only 2 days later, outside the gates of the McCormick factory, the situation exploded. On May 3, 1886, violence erupted outside the McCormick factory. As striking workers gathered near the plant, replacement workers began leaving through the factory gates at the end of the day. Angry crowds surged towards them, rocks were thrown, shouts filling the streets. Then the Chicago police moved in. Officers opened fire into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, several workers lay dead or dying in the street. News of the shooting spread rapidly across Chicago's labor movement, and that night, local anarchist organizers printed thousands of flyers calling for a protest meeting the following evening at Haymarket Square. Some versions of the flyers carried the message, "Working men, arm yourselves." By the next evening, May 4th, dark clouds hung over Chicago. Rain drifted across the city streets as workers slowly gathered at Haymarket Square on the city's west side. The square itself was not much more than an open market area surrounded by warehouses, factories, saloons, and narrow streets lined with brick buildings. Horse-drawn wagons rattled over wet cobblestones, gas lamps flickered in the rain. Smoke from nearby factories drifted through the cold night air. At first, the gathering was relatively calm. Compared to the earlier labor marches, the crowd was surprisingly small. Some people stood listening quietly to speeches, others lingered near the edges of the square beneath umbrellas and awnings trying to avoid the rain. Labor organizers climbed into a wagon being used as a makeshift stage and began speaking about workers' rights, police violence, and the killings outside McCormick just the day before. One of the speakers was August Spies, a German-born labor activist who had witnessed police shootings firsthand. Nearby, small groups of police officers watched from a distance beneath the dim streetlights. City authorities had already become deeply nervous about the rally. Newspapers had spent days warning the anarchists were preparing for violence. Business leaders feared the meeting could erupt into a riot, but as the night wore on, that violence still hadn't come. In fact, by around 10 p.m., the crowd had already begun thinning out. Rain continued falling steadily across the square, and some workers started heading home. Shopkeepers had closed their doors for the night, and even Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison, who had personally attended the rally to observe the situation, reported believing the meeting was peaceful enough to leave early. But only minutes later, nearly 200 police officers began marching toward Haymarket Square in formation. Their boots splashed through the rain-soaked streets as they approached the remaining crowd, and somewhere in the darkness nearby, a problem was waiting to happen. By the time the police reached Haymarket Square, the rally was already nearly over. Rain continued dripping from rooftops and awnings as the remaining crowd clustered around the speaker's wagon. Samuel Fielden, an English-born labor organizer, was in the middle of his speech when the police column pushed into the square. At the front of the formation stood Police Inspector John Bonfield. Behind him marched nearly 200 armed officers. The sound of boots striking wet cobblestones echoed through the streets as the police advanced towards the wagon. Then Bonfield gave the order for the crowd to disperse. Fielden protested that the rally was peaceful. Witnesses later claim he had barely finished speaking when all of a sudden something arced through the darkness. A small object high above the crowd. Then it landed among the police lines. For a split second, nothing happened. And then the night exploded. A violent blast ripped through the square. Smoke and fire erupted beneath the police formation as metal fragments ripped through the crowd. Officers were thrown to the ground. Screams echoed across the street. One policeman, Matthias Deegan, collapsed mortally wounded near the center of the explosion. And almost instantly, panic consumed Haymarket Square. Police began firing wildly into the darkness. Workers and bystanders scattered in every direction. Gunshots cracked through the rain. Some witnesses later claimed the police fired blindly into the crowd. Others insisted armed anarchists returned fire from the streets and alleyways. In the chaos, visibility collapsed beneath smoke, rain, and muzzle flashes. Nobody seemed to know who was shooting at who. The horses panicked, men fell screaming onto the pavement, windows shattered nearby, and within moments, Haymarket Square had transformed into a complete confusion and bloodshed. And then, almost as suddenly as it begun, it was over. The crowd vanished into the dark streets of Chicago. Smoke drifted across the square beneath the gaslight lamps. Wounded officers lay scattered across the wet pavement, and at least 7 policemen would eventually die from their injuries. An unknown number of civilians had also been killed or wounded in the gunfire. But in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, one terrifying fact became clear. Nobody knew who threw the bomb. And over the next few days, that uncertainty would push Chicago into an absolute hysteria. By sunrise the next morning, Chicago was in shock. Newspapers across the city exploded with terrifying headlines about anarchists, bomb throwers, and revolution. Some articles that describe the Haymarket bombing as the beginning of a nationwide uprising against American society itself. Others demanded revenge, and editorials called for radical labor leaders to be executed. Almost overnight, fear spread far beyond Chicago. Across the country, Americans read dramatic reports describing foreign anarchists plotting violence in the streets of major cities. For many middle and upper-class Americans already nervous about the labor unrest, Haymarket seemed to confirm their worst fears. The labor movement itself quickly became associated with terrorism in the public imagination. And Chicago authorities? They responded with overwhelming force. Police launched raids across immigrant neighborhoods, union meeting halls, newspaper offices, and private homes. Officers stormed the buildings searching for bombs, weapons, and radical literature. Hundreds of suspected anarchists and labor activists were rounded up for questioning. Some were beaten during interrogations. Others were detained simply for possessing a socialist newspaper or attending a labor meeting. German immigrant communities in particular came under intense suspicion. At times, the atmosphere inside the city bordered on paranoia. Armed police patrolled the streets while newspapers warned that hidden anarchist cells could strike again at any moment. But despite the massive investigation, authorities still faced one enormous problem. They still did not know who threw the bomb at Haymarket Square. Witness accounts were chaotic and contradictory. Smoke, rain, darkness, and gunfire made it almost impossible to identify the attacker. Yet under growing public pressure, prosecutors became determined to hold someone responsible. Eventually, police found their attention on a group of well-known anarchist organizers connected to Chicago's labor movement. Among them were August Spies, Albert Parsons, Samuel Fielden, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, Louis Ling, Michael Schwab, and Oscar Neebe. Some had spoken publicly at labor rallies, some published radical newspapers, but several of the accused hadn't even been present when the bomb exploded at all. And none could be directly tied to the attack itself, but that would not matter. In the aftermath of Haymarket, Chicago no longer seemed interested in finding the individual who threw the bomb. The city wanted enemies, and had already decided who those enemies would be. The trial of Haymarket defendants began on June 21, 1886. But long before the first witness ever took the stand, many people believed the outcome had already been decided. Fear and anger still consumed Chicago after the bombing at Haymarket Square. Newspapers demanded harsh punishment for anarchists. Business leaders warned that the city itself was under threat from radical revolutionaries. And inside the crowded courtroom, the trial quickly became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in American history. Presiding over the case was Judge Joseph Gary. Gary had a reputation for strict courtroom control and strong support for law and order. To supporters, he was a disciplined judge attempting to maintain stability during a national crisis. To critics, he became a symbol of a trial deeply tilted against the defendants from the very beginning. Leading the prosecution was the state's attorney as Julius Grinnell. Grinnell approached the case with a sweeping argument that shocked even some legal observers of the time. Prosecutor openly admitted they could not prove who had physically thrown the bomb. Instead, Grinnell argued that the defendants were responsible because their speeches, newspaper, and political rhetoric had allegedly inspired the violence. During one moment in court, Grinnell reportedly told the jury, "Convict these men, make examples of them, hang them, and you save our institutions, our society." The statement captured the atmosphere surrounding the entire trial. This wasn't about identifying a bomber. It had become a battle over anarchism, labor radicalism, immigration, and the early Epstein class's fear of social collapse itself. From the start, jury selection became one of the most controversial parts of the entire proceeding. Defense attorneys repeatedly argued that many of the potential jurors had already formed opinions about the defendant's guilt after reading inflammatory newspaper coverage for weeks. Several admitted openly during questioning that they believed anarchists were dangerous enemies of society. Yet many were still allowed onto the jury anyways. Some prospective jurors stated that they believed the defendants were probably guilty before hearing any evidence at all. One reportedly admitted he could not remain impartial because what he already read in the newspapers covering the bombing. Another declared openly that radicals should be punished harshly regardless of who actually threw the bomb. Defense lawyers objected repeatedly. Judge Gary overruled many of those objections. The final jury consisted largely of middle-class businessmen, clerks, and individuals viewed as hostile towards organized labor and anarchism. Critics would later argue that the jury had effectively been handpicked to secure convictions. The defense team itself faced enormous challenges. Attorneys William Foster and Moses Salomon attempted to argue that prosecutors were criminalizing political beliefs rather than proving direct involvement in a murder. They reminded jurors repeatedly that no witness had identified the actual bomber, no physical evidence connected most of these defendants to the attack itself, and several defendants had not been present near the explosion when it occurred. But prosecutors countered by flooding the courtroom with anarchist writings, speeches, political pamphlets, and testimony about radical ideology. The state portrayed the defendants not only as suspects but as leaders of a dangerous revolutionary conspiracy. Among all the defendants, one man stood out especially to prosecutors: Louis Lang. Lang was only 22 years old, but he openly embraced revolutionary violence. Bomb-making materials discovered in his apartment became some of the prosecution's strongest physical evidence. During the trial, Ling behaved with open hostility towards the court and showed little fear of the possible consequences. His behaviors reinforced public fears about anarchists and likely damaged the defense significantly. Meanwhile, another defendant drew attention for the exact opposite reason. Oscar Neebe appeared far less directly connected to violence than the others. Neebe had worked as a salesman and labor activist connected to the anarchist circles. But prosecutors struggled to place him at the center of the Haymarket rally itself. He hadn't been present near the speaker's wagon when the bomb exploded. There was little evidence linking him to planning violence or manufacturing explosives. Even compared to the other defendants, Neebe appeared peripheral to the actual events of May 4th, but prosecutors still insisted he shared responsibility through his involvement in the broader anarchist movement. In the end, the jury appeared to reach a compromise regarding him, and even that outcome had stunned many of the observers, considering how weak the evidence against him actually was. As the weeks dragged on, hostility inside the courtroom only intensified. Spectators frequently reacted angrily to testimony supporting the defendants. Newspapers continued publishing sensational stories portraying the accused men as foreign radicals bent on destroying American society. Outside the courthouse, armed police remained constantly present. Chicago increasingly felt less like a city conducting a criminal trial and more like a city at war with its own fears. Finally, on August 20th, 1886, the verdict arrived. 7 men were sentenced to death. Oscar Neebe received 15 years in prison. Across the United States and Europe, outrage erupted almost immediately. Critics condemned the proceedings as political prosecution disguised as justice. Others celebrated the verdict as necessary to stop violent revolution before it spread further across America. But inside their jail cells, the condemned men now faced a terrifying reality. The state of Illinois intended to hang them. After the verdicts were announced, the fight to save the condemned men intensified immediately. Across the United States and Europe, activists, labor organizers, journalists, and political leaders condemned the Haymarket trial as deeply unjust. Petitions demanding clemency flooded into Illinois. Public meetings were held in major cities around the world. To supporters of the defendants, the men had become political prisoners, condemned not for proven murder, but for their ideas. But inside Chicago, fear of anarchism remained absolutely overwhelming. Newspapers continued describing the condemned men as violent revolutionaries who deserved death. Police remained nervous about possible retaliation or rescue attempts. And meanwhile, inside the Cook County Jail, the condemned prisoners waited. Some spent their final months writing letters, giving interviews, and defending their beliefs. Albert Parsons remained one of the most visible figures among them. Parsons had actually escaped arrest immediately after the bombing and could have fled the city entirely. Instead, he later walked into court voluntarily to stand trial beside the other defendants. Outside the prison walls, his wife, Lucy Parsons, became one of the most outspoken defendants of the accused men. Lucy Parsons was already a controversial figure in America long before Haymarket. Historians still debate parts of her background, but many believe she was African American, Mexican, and Native American ancestry. In the decades after the Civil War, that alone could make life dangerous in parts of the United States. Her marriage to Albert Parsons had begun in Texas during Reconstruction, a time when interracial relationships often triggered violent backlash across the South. The couple reportedly faced threats and harassment severe enough that they eventually left Texas and moved to Chicago. There, both Lucy and Albert became deeply involved in labor activism and the radical politics. Lucy herself quickly gained a reputation as a fierce public speaker capable of drawing enormous crowds. Authorities considered her extremely dangerous because her ability to rally sympathy for the workers, anarchists, and the condemned Haymarket defendants. This was a problem to them. Even after Albert Parsons was sentenced to death, Lucy refused to stop speaking publicly against the trial and the executions. But as the execution dates approached, hope for clemency began disappearing rapidly. Appeals failed one after another. Then, just days before the execution, one final shocking incident changed the course of the story. On November 10, 1887, prison guards heard a sudden explosion inside the cell of Lewis Lane. When they rushed inside, they found the young anarchist lying horribly wounded. Lane had apparently hidden a small dynamite cap inside his mouth and detonated it rather than face execution on the gallows. He died several hours later. This violent suicide only deepened public fascination and fear surrounding the Haymarket defendants. The following morning, November 11, 1887, 4 men of the 7 condemned were led to the gallows: Albert Parsons, August Spies, Adolph Fisher, and George Engel. Armed guards surrounded the jail as crowds gathered outside waiting for news of the executions. Some witnesses later describe an eerie silence hanging over the prison grounds that morning. Moments before the trapdoor opened, several of the condemned men shouted final statements defending anarchism and the labor movement. August Spies cried out, "The time will come when your silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." Then the trapdoor dropped. The executions immediately transformed the Haymarket defendants into martyrs for the labor movements around the world. Massive funeral processions followed in Chicago. Tens of thousands reportedly attended. And although the bombing at Haymarket Square had triggered fear and repression across America, the event also permanently reshaped the global labor movement itself. In many countries, May 1st became International Workers' Day, a direct legacy of the violence, fear, and bloodshed that had unfolded in Chicago at Haymarket Square. But perhaps the strangest part of the entire story still remains unsolved to this day. Nobody knows for certain who threw the bomb at Haymarket Square. The Haymarket affair had sent shockwaves across the United States, and for many Americans, the bombing confirmed their growing fears that labor unrest would spiral into open violence and revolution. But for the workers struggling inside factories, steel mills, rail yards, and coal mines, Haymarket became something very different: a warning. It showed just how far powerful industries, police forces, and state governments were willing to go in order to crush organized labor. And over the next several decades, the conflict between workers and industrial America only became more violent. By the late 1800s, steel had become the backbone of America's Industrial Revolution. Railroads stretched across the continent. Massive bridges rose over rivers and valleys. Cities expanded upward for the first time in human history as steel-framed skyscrapers began transforming the urban skylines. And at the center of that transformation stood one man, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had arrived in the United States from Scotland as a poor immigrant child decades earlier. By the 1890s, he'd become one of the wealthiest and the most powerful industrialists in America. His company, Carnegie Steel, dominated the growing steel industry and generated enormous fortunes during the rise of industrial America. But those fortunes were built inside places that often resembled industrial hell. One of the largest and most important parts of Carnegie's empire stood along the Monongahela River. near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Homestead Steelworks. The mill roared with the sound of machinery, steam, and molten metal. Furnaces burned so hot they illuminated the night sky with an eerie orange glow visible for miles. Workers endured exhausting shifts surrounded by extreme heat, toxic smoke, deafening noise, and dangerous machinery capable of killing a man instantly. Injuries inside the steel mill were common. Burns, crushed limbs, blindness, and deadly accidents had become accepted as part of industrial labor in America. Yet despite the brutal conditions, skilled steelworkers at Homestead still possessed something many other industrial workers lacked: power. Much of that power came through the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Founded during the violent labor struggles of the 1870s, the union had grown into one of the strongest labor organizations in the country. Skilled workers inside major steel mills had specialized knowledge that companies could not easily replace overnight. Over the years, the union had successfully fought for higher wages and resisted attempts by steel companies to weaken organized labor. And nowhere was union power stronger than at Homestead. Workers there viewed the mill not simply as a workplace, but as a union stronghold. To many labor leaders, Homestead represented proof that industrial workers could stand against even the largest corporations in America. But by the early 1890s, the steel industry itself was beginning to change. New technology increasingly reduced the need for highly skilled labor. Factory owners realized machines and cheaper immigrant labor could slowly replace many union workers who had once been indispensable. And inside Carnegie Steel, one man became convinced that the company could no longer tolerate a powerful union controlling conditions at Homestead. His name? Henry Clay Frick. And unlike Carnegie, Frick had little interest in compromise. Long before Homestead became a battlefield, Henry Clay Frick had already spent years learning how industrial wars were fought. Frick's empire was built on the coal and coke regions of western Pennsylvania, where thousands of laborers worked among mines, railroads, and massive rows of burning coke ovens that operated day and night. Coke production was filthy, it was exhausting, and it was dangerous work. Men labored in suffocating heat surrounded by smoke and toxic gases. Entire hillsides glowed orange at night from the ovens burning across the region. By the 1880s, Frick had become one of the most powerful coke producers in America. But his growing empire also brought growing labor unrest. Workers across Pennsylvania industrial regions increasingly organized against dangerous conditions, wage disputes, and the near-total control companies exercised over workers' lives inside company towns. Frick responded harshly. He believed the industrial production depended on discipline and absolute authority. In his view, unions threatened both of those things. One of the largest labor confrontations before Homestead erupted in the Connellsville coke region in 1887. Thousands of coke workers launched strikes demanding higher wages and resisting company control. The strikes spread across large portions of the region, threatening production inside Frick's operations. Determined to keep his coke ovens running, Frick increasingly turned toward armed protection and strike-breaking tactics. Guards were stationed around company property. Armed watchmen patrolled industrial facilities. Workers suspected of being union organizers or labor activists were being monitored constantly. As the tension escalated, Frick relied heavily on private security forces connected to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. By this period, the Pinkertons had already become infamous throughout American labor disputes, and it's even rumored a Pinkerton agent threw the bomb at Haymarket to damage the labor strikes. Though officially a detective agency, Pinkerton operatives increasingly functioned as a private industrial army for wealthy corporations. Companies hired them to infiltrate unions, gather intelligence on labor organizers, protect strikebreakers, and intimidate workers during strikes. During the Connellsville labor unrest, Pinkerton-connected operatives and armed guards were used to secure industrial sites and discourage workers from interfering with production. The exact scale of Pinkerton involvement during the coke strikes remains debated by historians, but the broader strategy, unmistakable. Frick was already building a system that relied on surveillance, armed security, and industrial force to keep suppressed labor resistance. Won't be the last time America sees this playbook. Not by a long shot. Workers across the region learned to associate private detectives, armed guards, and industrial security forces with intimidation and violence. And Frick learned something equally important: force works. The strike eventually weakened, production resumed, and Frick emerged more convinced than ever that organized labor could be defeated through aggressive tactics and overwhelming control. So violence is the answer when they have an issue, but it's not okay for the rest of us. Those earlier confrontations shaped nearly everything that followed at Homestead. By the time Frick arrived at Carnegie Steel, he already viewed labor disputes less as negotiations and more as a military campaign that had to be won. To him, compromise showed weakness. Control, that came first. And if workers resisted control, force would be used to break them. So when tensions inside the Homestead steelworkers plant began escalating in 1892, Frick didn't approach the situation like a businessman attempting to settle a labor disagreement. He approached it like a commander preparing for siege warfare. By the summer of 1892, tensions inside the Homestead Steelworks were approaching a breaking point. The contract between Carnegie Steel and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was set to expire on June 30th. Behind the scenes, Frick had already made his intentions clear. He wanted the union destroyed. Publicly, Carnegie often presented himself as a different kind of industrialist. He gave speeches about education, philanthropy, and the responsibility of wealth. In newspaper interviews and public statements, Carnegie sometimes spoke sympathetically about labor compared to many other powerful businessmen of the era, and he even claimed that workers had the right to organize under certain conditions. But behind the scenes, the relationship with Carnegie and Frick was far more complicated. Carnegie spent much of 1892 overseas in Scotland at his massive Skibbo estate, while tensions escalated at Homestead. Officially, Frick handled day-to-day operations at Carnegie Steel in America. That distance later allowed Carnegie to publicly avoid direct responsibility for many of the decisions made during this strike. But private correspondence between the two men tells a considerably more revealing story. Before leaving for Scotland, Carnegie had already approved Frick's increasingly aggressive strategy toward the Union at Homestead. In letters exchanged between them, Carnegie made clear he believed the power of Amalgamated Association had to be broken. Though Carnegie sometimes expressed concern about public perception and violence, he continued supporting Frick's overall objective throughout the conflict. And at one point, Carnegie reportedly wrote that the Homestead operation could not continue successfully while the Union maintained so much control inside the plant. Privately, both men understood what was happening at Homestead represented far more than a normal wage dispute. The future balance of power between industrial corporations and organized labor, it was being tested. Frick approached the situation aggressively and directly. Carnegie, meanwhile, maintained distance while allowing Frick broader authority to handle the confrontation however he believed necessary. Critics later accused Carnegie of deliberately positioning himself so that he could preserve his public image while Frick carried out the dirty work of union suppression. And some historians described the relationship almost as a simple division of roles. Carnegie remained the public-facing industrialist philosopher. Frick became the enforcer. Negotiations had deteriorated during the summer of 1892. Communication between the two men increasingly focused on the strategy, production concerns, union resistance, and the possibility of reopening Homestead without organized labor entirely. Frick's preparations reflected that mindset. This was no longer being treated like a labor negotiation. It was becoming an operation to seize and hold industrial territory. Massive fences were erected around the Homestead plant. 3 miles of high wooden fencing, topped with barbed wire, surrounded sections of the complex. Searchlights were installed. Rifle ports were cut into the walls, allowing armed guards to fire outward if necessary. Workers stared at the growing fortifications in disbelief. The steel mill increasingly resembled a military compound instead of a factory. Soon workers throughout Homestead began referring to the plant by a new name, Fort Frick. Then, on June 28th, before the contract had even officially expired, Frick ordered the plant locked down. Workers arriving at the mill found themselves shut out completely. Notices announced the company would no longer negotiate with the union under its current demands. Thousands of workers suddenly found themselves unemployed and facing an uncertain future. But instead of collapsing immediately, the lockout unified much of the town against Carnegie Steel. Homestead quickly transformed into something closer to an organized resistance movement than a normal labor strike. Mass meetings filled local halls and public spaces. Workers organized patrols throughout the town. Armed volunteers monitored roads, railroad crossings, and especially the river beside the steel mill. Rumors spread constantly. Some workers believed Frick planned to bring in strikebreakers, scabs, under armed protection. Others warned private security forces might attempt to seize the plant by force. Across Homestead, tensions settled over the town like smoke from the steel furnaces. Families waited anxiously for the news. Men gathered in saloons and union halls discussing what might happen next. Many workers still hoped the company might eventually return to negotiations, but Frick, he never intended to compromise. Quietly behind the scenes, he finalized arrangements with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Nearly 300 armed Pinkerton guards were preparing to travel by river toward Homestead. Their mission was simple: retake the steel mill, reopen production, and crush the strike. As June turned into July, Homestead began to feel less like a steel town and more like a community preparing for war. Every day, crowds gathered outside the locked steel mill, watching the fences, the guards, and the smokeless furnaces sitting idle behind the walls of Fort Frick. Union leaders organized mass meetings across town while armed workers patrolled roads, railroad crossings, river access points all around the plant. Rumors spread constantly through saloons, boarding houses, and union halls. Some claimed Frick planned to secretly import strikebreakers from outside of Pennsylvania. Others warned that armed agents were already being assembled somewhere beyond Pittsburgh. Most workers believed the company would eventually attempt to retake the mill by force, and they were right. The plan was carefully organized. It involved hundreds of Pinkerton agents that would travel under the cover of darkness by river barge to the Homestead Steelworks. Once inside the plant, they would secure the mill, protect replacement workers, and allow Carnegie Steel to restart production without the Union. Frick believed speed and surprise would prevent large-scale resistance, but secrecy quickly began breaking down. Workers inside Homestead had their own information networks. Railroad employees, river workers, sympathetic laborers, and local residents passed rumors through town almost constantly. Before long, many strikers became convinced something was about to happen along the river, and the Union responded immediately. Armed patrol boats monitoring sections of the river at night. Watchers stood guard along riverbanks for hours at a time, staring into the darkness for signs of approaching barges. Men carried rifles openly through town. Church bells and factory whistles were prepared as emergency alarms in case the Pinkertons appeared. By early July, the atmosphere throughout Homestead had become deeply tense and almost surreal. Families waited nervously inside crowded boarding houses, listening to the rumors spreading from street to street. Children watched armed men standing guard near the riverbanks. Saloons remained packed late into the night as workers debated what would happen if the Pinkertons arrived. Some still hoped that violence could be avoided. Others believed bloodshed was now inevitable. Then, July 5th, 1892, the rumors became reality. Two large barges quietly departed downriver, carrying nearly 300 armed Pinkerton guards towards Homestead. Most carried Winchester rifles. Some wore metal badges beneath heavy coats, despite the summer heat. Orders were given to maintain silence during the journey. The barges drifted slowly through the darkness toward the steel town waiting ahead. The word spread faster than the Pinkertons expected. Before dawn, alarm whistles began screaming across Homestead. Workers rushed from homes, saloons, and boarding houses toward the river. Men grabbed rifles, revolvers, and whatever weapons they could find. Crowds formed rapidly along the riverbank beside the steel mill. And as the first light of morning began creeping across the river, Pinkerton barges finally came into view. It broke slowly over the river on July 6, 1892, and a thin layer of fog drifted above the waters. Thousands of workers and townspeople gathered along those riverbanks outside the Homestead Steelworks. Across the water, the two barges carrying the Pinkerton agents floated silently toward the mill. Many workers had spent the entire night waiting for them. Some stood armed with hunting rifles and revolvers. Others carried makeshift weapons, clubs, iron tools, really whatever they had at hand. Women and children gathered behind the crowds, watching nervously from nearby hillsides, rooftops, and railroad embankments. As the barges approached the landing area near the mill, workers surged toward the riverbank, shouting warnings for Pinkertons to turn back. But the agents continued forward. And then suddenly, a shot rings out. To this day, nobody knows with certainty who fired first. Some witnesses claim that the Pinkertons opened fire from the barges. Others insist armed workers fired first from the shore. Within seconds, the river erupted in chaos. Gunfire exploded from both sides as bullets tore through smoke and morning fog. Workers dropped behind piles of steel, railroad cars, and river embankments while Pinkerton agents fired from the barges toward the shore. The battle quickly intensified in a full-scale firefight. Crowds across Homestead continued growing throughout the morning. Thousands of townspeople flooded toward the riverfront after hearing church bells and factory whistles sounding throughout the town. Now, some workers attempted to push floating, burning debris toward the barges. Now, some other people had dragged out an old cannon and fired it toward the Pinkertons trapped near the shoreline. The smoke had drifted across the river as rifle fire echoed through the valley for hours. Several workers were killed during the fight. Pinkerton agents also began falling wounded on the barges. Conditions aboard the boats deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures climbed under the summer heat while the trapped agents struggled to return fire and protect the wounded around them. Meanwhile, anger among the crowds along the riverbank intensified by the hour. To many workers, the Pinkertons represented everything they hate about industrial power in America. They were not seen as law enforcement, but as hired guns brought in by wealthy corporations to break the workforce. As the day dragged on, the Pinkertons realized they were losing control of the situation. They remained trapped between the river and thousands of armed workers surrounding the shoreline. And eventually, negotiations began for surrender. A white flag reportedly appeared above the barges, but were shot down several times before being accepted. By late afternoon, the Pinkerton agents agreed to lay down their weapons, but the surrender did not end the violence. As the agents disembarked from the barges, furious crowds surged towards them. Workers and townspeople beat many of the surrendering Pinkertons as they were marched through Homestead. Some agents were kicked, clubbed, and struck with rocks, while crowds screamed insults and threats from all around. Several were left bloodied and barely conscious before local leaders finally managed to restore some order. And by the end of the battle, multiple workers and Pinkerton agents were dead. And dozens more laid wounded. News of the fighting spread rapidly across the United States. Newspaper headlines described scenes that sounded less like a labor dispute and more like open warfare. For a brief moment, it appeared the workers of Homestead had actually defeated one of the most powerful corporations in America. But the conflict wasn't over, and Frick was already preparing his next move. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Homestead, many workers believed they had won. The Pinkertons had surrendered. Crowds still controlled the streets surrounding the steel mill, and across much of the country, newspapers published dramatic images of armed workers forcing one of America's most feared private security forces into retreat. But this victory, it wouldn't last long. Frick had no intention of surrendering control of Homestead Steelworks or anything for that matter. Almost immediately after the battle, Carnegie Steel appealed to the state government for military intervention. Frick and company officials argued that order had collapsed in Homestead and the armed strikers now threatened private property and industrial production. So Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattinson approved the request. And within days, the state moved against the workers. On July 12, 1892, thousands of Pennsylvania National Guard troops marched into Homestead. Soldiers carrying rifles and bayonets flooded the town, while artillery units and military supply wagons rolled through the streets behind them. Residents watched silently from windows, rooftops, and sidewalks as the state effectively occupied the steel town. Unlike the Pinkertons, the National Guards possessed overwhelming manpower, organization, and legal authority. Workers understood immediately that open armed resistance against state troops would likely just end in a massacre. One by one, the Union's advantages disappeared. Under military protection, Carnegie Steel slowly began bringing replacement workers into the plant. Production inside the mill gradually resumed. The strike leaders found themselves increasingly isolated, while newspapers across the country became more hostile toward the Union after the post-surrender violence at the riverfront. And then, just as tensions inside Homestead remained dangerously high, the conflict takes another turn. Hundreds of miles away in Pittsburgh, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman decided Frick deserved to die. Berkman was a Russian immigrant deeply influenced by the revolutionary anarchist ideology. He believed the dramatic acts of political violence could inspire workers to rise against industrial capitalism and oppressive authority. To Berkman, Frick had become the perfect symbol of corporate brutality in America. On July 23, 1892, Berkman entered Frick's Pittsburgh office armed with a revolver and a sharpened steel file. Inside the office, Frick was meeting with company officials and recovering from the stress of the ongoing strike crisis. Suddenly, Berkman pulled the revolver and opened fire at close range. Frick was struck multiple times, but he didn't die. As chaos erupted inside the office, Berkman lunged forward and stabbed Frick repeatedly with the sharpened file. Even after being shot and stabbed, Frick reportedly continued struggling against his attacker until other men inside the office finally subdued Berkman. The assassination attempt immediately dominated national headlines. And for the labor movement, the timing could not have been worse. Newspapers across the country now linked the Homestead strike directly with anarchism, political extremism, and attempted murder. Public sympathy for the workers began collapsing quickly. Frick himself became something of a symbol of industrial resilience after surviving the attack. Remarkably, he returned to work only days later despite his injuries. Meanwhile, Alexander Berkman was arrested and eventually sentenced to prison. Inside Homestead, though, the strikes continued weakening under military occupation. Steelworkers who once believed they stood on the verge of victory now watched replacement laborers pass through the gates of Fort Frick under armed guard. Slowly, painfully, the strike began to collapse. By the end of 1892, the Homestead strike was effectively over. After months of violence, occupation, fear, and economic pressure, the Amalgamated Association could no longer hold the line against Carnegie Steel. One by one, exhausted workers began returning to the mill under the company's terms. Others left Homestead entirely, searching for work elsewhere. Some families had already burned through their savings months earlier. And relief funds dwindled. Hunger spread throughout parts of the community, and under the protection of the state troops and company security, Carnegie Steel successfully reopened the Homestead plant with large numbers of non-union laborers. The union that had once represented one of the strongest forces in American industry had been shattered. For Frick, the outcome confirmed everything he already believed about industrial power. The strike had been broken, production resumed, corporate control had survived. Andrew Carnegie, meanwhile, remained thousands of miles away in Scotland during much of this conflict. Publicly, he attempted to distance himself from the violence and bloodshed associated with Homestead, but critics were unconvinced. The relationship between Carnegie and Frick itself eventually deteriorated after Homestead, though both men remained enormously wealthy and powerful. But for organized labor in America, the consequences of Homestead were devastating. The defeat sent shockwaves throughout the labor movement. Industrial corporations across the country now saw a blueprint for defeating powerful unions. Private security forces, state militias, scabs, lockouts, surveillance, and military intervention had all been used together to crush one of the strongest labor organizations in America. And after Homestead, union influence inside the steel industry collapsed for decades. Many workers increasingly realized they were not simply negotiating with employers anymore. They were confronting corporations with enormous financial resources, political influence, private security forces, and sometimes even the support of state governments themselves. Homestead also permanently changed how many Americans viewed those labor disputes. The images coming out of Pennsylvania, armed workers firing rifles from the riverbanks, Pinkerton agents surrendering beneath smoke and gunfire, National Guard troops occupying an industrial town, resembled scenes from wartime more than from ordinary strikes. America's labor conflicts were becoming militarized, and over the next several decades, the violence would only escalate further. In the coal fields, mining camps, and isolated company towns across the country, tensions between workers and industrial power continued building toward even deadlier confrontations. Soon, those conflicts would spread, bringing us back to Illinois, where entire communities would find themselves trapped between companies, private armies, the federal government, and more armed labor uprisings.